This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Welcome to The Hypnotist, the show that gives you inside access to cutting-edge hypnosis with real clients facing genuine issues. Brought to you by the hypnotherapist demanded by celebrities, CEOs, and even royalty, Adam Cox. These recordings took place live from Adam's clinic in London's world-famous Harley Street. So, get yourself comfortable and enjoy today's episode of The Hypnotist.
Hi, it's Adam here, and you're about to listen to a hypnosis interview. This isn't a hypnosis session. This is where I'm interviewing a very respected and well-renowned hypnotherapist called Dale Turnbull. And Dale was originally from Southwest London, now lives in Canada, and he's one of the leading experts on metaphor, but specifically the movement of metaphor. And it uses the metaphor that the client presents to explore that and to change the context and to create really powerful changes. So I have a nice chat with Dale where we explore what are the metaphors that really shape our life, about who we are, about what life is about what can be empowering or disempowering. And I pick his brains about some of the most empowering and disempowering metaphors that he's discovered. He also shares a few of his upcoming events. He's got lots of different trainings and events that he's organizing. We're both going to be at HypnoThoughts Live in Vegas in the summer and also at the UK Hypnosis Conference in London in November. So if you want to see us both live, you certainly can do either in Vegas or in London this year. He also does a nice experiment, a way of thinking. So it's a thought experiment asking you to think about a relationship that isn't quite ideal. Maybe it's a friend that you've fallen out with, maybe some kind of issue, a colleague that you're not quite gelling with. And the way that you think about how you think about that person, you might be able to experience quite an interesting change. For now, I would encourage you to find a nice cozy place. This is the kind of thing that you don't need your eyes closed. You can just have it on the background, listen to our conversation. So just relax and enjoy this conversation. Hi, it's Adam here, and welcome to The Hypnotist. Only today, I'm not your hypnotist. We have a guest hypnotist, and I'm joined by Dale Turnbull. Welcome to the show.
Great. Thanks for inviting me. Great to be here.
Great to have you here. And one of the questions I always like to ask, because everyone's story is a little bit different, is there's normally something that's the catalyst, that someone is normal everyday person and then they kind of discover this world we call hypnosis. And once they get in, they can't quite get out of that place. So tell us your story. How did you become a hypnotherapist?
So from my side, it's probably a little bit different. I went in through the route of NLP, but where I sort of started off, I'd always sort of had a bit of an interest within psychology. I loved watching Paul McKenna on TV, and my mum's like, "You're never going to learn hypnosis." And I don't know, it's just sort of always been there. I wanted to be a psychotherapist, but didn't study hard enough. But I ended up in the corporate sphere, in learning and development, specifically working with recruiters, training them to be the best they could be. But I started to get really frustrated. I don't know if you've ever had this experience where you tell someone to do something once, twice, 3 times, and they just don't freaking do it, and you're like, why are you not doing it? Are you not motivated? You not got the skill? So for me, I was looking to see how I could enhance my communication to impact people, because it's really disempowering, I think, if we're like, well, they're not doing it, because that's putting the responsibility onto them. So I started to learn Myers-Briggs personality, and I started to tailor my experience that way. But there was one guy who came in, an external trainer. For those of you football fans out there, he was the educational psychologist for Leicester City, and he helped them win the Premiership. And when I was talking to him, I was like, what is this guy doing? he's doing something very different that I'd never seen before. And he's like, well, to be honest, I studied sports psychology, but once I decided to learn NLP, then my whole world changed. So I'm like, I'm going to invest. I jumped all in. I studied from John Grinder, Richard Bandler, the creators of NLP. And for me, it was really about, how do you tailor your experience? How do you tailor your communication? So not one, does it resonate with the person, with their frame, with their map of the world, with what's going on inside them, but also how can you do it to increase skill acquisition, knowledge, specifically within the training and development space. Now, from there, obviously, when you first do hypnosis or NLP, you're like, oh my God, there's so many things you can do with this. So I started to play about helping people with like fear of the phone, because it was phone-based stuff. I actually worked with somebody who was dyslexic. It was really quite a strange example, which really opened my eyes, because I was like, okay, so how are you doing the dyslexia? What happens? And she's like, well, I read it, which is fine. But then if I don't understand it, I read it again and all the words jumble up. Essentially, she started to get really stressed when she started reading, and then all the letters went everywhere. So we did some NLP/hypnosis to basically, as opposed to when she read it and didn't understand, she went into a more relaxed place and she could actually read to her child. And I was like, wow, it just opened up a whole new world of possibility. So since then, I've been learning lots of different things, trying to find out, okay, what are the tools that I can gather that can really make the difference? And this is where I stumbled onto the metaphors of movement work, which I teach and I'm really passionate about, because I think for me, there are two different types of people who get into the world of personal change. There are those like me who really want to make an impact and really impact people and come from actually other focused. And then the other side, you've got people who are more into their own personal development, their own growth. And then they realize, oh, I can do this with other people. So yeah, I've always sort of struggled to self-respect, introspect, do the work on myself. Loved working with others, but struggled to work on myself. And the metaphors work, which I found was a really nice bridge and a gap that really helped for me to actually look at myself in a very non-confrontational way, to understand actually what's going on inside. Because half the time, I just don't have the words. So that's a little bit of a flavor of what I am, where I've come from, and where I'm at now.
And I think where I really resonate is that NLP is my kind of on-ramp to hypnosis, and the early Bandler and Grinder, books, Structure of Magic and Frogs into Princes. And what I've noticed is that NLPers that kind of move into hypnosis, there tends to be a part of NLP that really kind of resonates with them more. And sometimes it's the linguistic patterns, and sometimes, like me, I got fascinated with the submodalities of, how's this different from this? Is it bigger, smaller, brighter? All of that kind of stuff. And sometimes it's the techniques or the eye movements. Was there anything that kind of really grabbed you when you kind of first started learning about NLP and you're like, wow, this seems like magic?
I think for me, it was just the ability to see change. I mean, when I tell a story that when I went to my first NLP training, it was actually in Portugal, 2 weeks. It was really great, super fun. But when I arrived, I'm like, everybody's a mess. Because they're all coming to work on themselves, and I was just really clueless. But what I found is it allowed me to shift a lot of different things. And so when I studied hypnosis, I actually studied something called alchemical hypnosis from a trainer called David Quigley. And he works, it's a little bit weird. So when I did NLP, I then did like a little bit of a course on shamanism, and then I did alchemical hypnosis. So it all sort of blended together. But for him, his approach, it's got some spiritual aspects to it, but it's got aspects of shamanism, that kind of thing. And I think for me, one of the things that really opened my eyes regarding hypnosis was actually taught to me on a Richard Bandler course by an Italian gentleman. I can't remember his name, but it was really fascinating. So there's a pattern some of you may be familiar with called the Betty Erickson pattern. The Betty Erickson pattern, you essentially pace someone's sensory experience. So like 3 things you see, 3 things you hear, 3 things you feel, and then you go 2, and then you go 1. Now, normally in hypnosis, we think about bringing people into a more relaxed place. That's like stereotypical hypnosis 101. But you can do those things. You can do these hypnotic patterns to impact emotional states. So you can say, I don't know, you're at a fun fair and you see all the bright, shiny things. There's lots going on. There's flashes, there's buzzes, and you hear the buzzes. And there's like children laughing and stroking. And you start to feel the excitement of being there in that place. Your heart's thumping. You're looking at, what do I do first? There's just so much color. I just can't focus. And then just something spoke to me that said, I'm going to pick that. And I jump right in. So you can use these hypnotic things not only to get people into a nice, relaxed, calming place, but you can use these things to help people shift states, shift ways of being. And I think this is where, when we connected on the more metaphorical side, it's how can we utilize hypnosis, stories, metaphors, NLP to give people a framework that aids in change? Because I think anyone who comes to us wanting help, they want help. So how can we set them up for success through metaphorical storytelling and all these different aspects? And for me, it's really about, what is the difference that makes the difference? How can I make that impact? And how can I make it specific to that person?
Yeah. And I guess where metaphors overlap with NLP is that phrase, the map is not the territory. And everyone's operating from these kind of internal models. And a good metaphor is a representation, not of the actual territory, but of the map. They're kind of saying, life's like a game, or it's not a dress rehearsal. Like there's a presupposition of an unconscious metaphor that they're running. And once you utilize that metaphor, there's a lot that you can kind of do within the structure that's already there. And I think where myself and you really kind of agree on is that it's better to utilize the pre-existing metaphor that the client is already running than just assume that the caterpillar turning into the butterfly is the perfect metaphor for them. Why not look for the metaphor that that's how they already perceive things?
100%. So, I mean, for example, the idea of feeling like you have to perform. Now, when you say that, I mean, what image comes to mind? Some people, it might be a stage. Some people, it might be an auditorium. Some people, a gladiatorial arena. But when someone's trying to perform, they're putting on a show. They're playing a role. They're not necessarily being themselves. They're putting on a play. Who wrote the play? Who wrote the script? What character are you playing in this moment? Are the audience there? Are they watching you? Are all eyes on you? We can look at communicating that experience so people feel really understood. And when you said the map is not the territory, the way I think both you and I work to an extent is the map is not the territory, but we know what maps have. Maps have hills, they have valleys, so we can talk about those things. Maps have specific locations, they have grid references, they have paths, they have roads. So as much as you don't know what the map is of the client, you can communicate the aspects that maps have, and those things will resonate. That's why I was really impressed with your training on hypnotic loops. And I know you're doing that at HypnoThoughts, so I think I'm actually going to come along. It's going to be great. One of the things for me is, what are the generalizations? What is the psychoeducation of human experience? What are facts of human life? We have, for example, introvert, extrovert. We have people who are more thinking or more emotional. Now, if we're coaches, therapists, and change workers, and we understand these, I don't want to say they're proven facts because I don't like being as concrete, but if we were to say that these generalizations fit the vast majority of the populace, we can use these understood principles to not only help the client change, but to educate them about human experience.
Absolutely. And I think what I really got from the idea of kind of maps not being the territory is that something doesn't have to be an exact replica for it to be useful. You're originally from London. I live northwest London. Everyone that's been to London has seen the map of the London Underground. And it bears nothing to the actual dimensions of where any of those locations are. But that doesn't mean it isn't very useful to find your way around London. And I think sometimes if someone has that kind of metaphor, whatever that metaphor, it's kind of like, I can't get past it if they're procrastinating, or, it's kind of, some people really feel like stress is like a sword of Damocles hanging over their head. They've got these kind of things, and it has connotations. Sometimes there's life or death connotations to something which is not that important, but if it's framed that way, it can kind of create a lot of pressure, a lot of stress on them, because that's the lens, that's the metaphor that they're running with that thing. And I believe that a lot of people, it's not like hypnosis is something they do when they see a hypnotist. They're already experiencing a form of hypnosis. Their own metaphors are a form of trance in which that's how they start perceiving the world. And sometimes what we're doing is just adjusting or changing the metaphors that they're already living with, and that can make a radical difference in their life.
100%. And I think one of the things, I mean, I always like to play a little bit of devil's advocate, a bit of a mismatcher for those who know meta programs. But what's interesting for me, so you're like, for some people, it's a matter of life or death. Now, that could be imagined. It could, like, a phobia is a very typical example. However, one of the things that I think sometimes is a challenge within coaching and hypnosis or therapy is there's an expectation that life will be better straight away. Now, for some people, life will get worse with change. For example, let's just imagine someone's really unhappy in their marriage or whatever, and they don't really want to work on it, but they're financially reliant on their partner, for example. If they make a choice, that split, there will be problems, there will be challenges, there will be issues, and sometimes life will actually get worse before it gets better. And I think this is where some of the metaphors of movement work can be useful, because it really looks at what's the unconscious structure under the surface. And we can just have a conversation about these things, because I think that there is often this sort of painted picture of everything's going to be great, everything's going to be beautiful. But like, for example, clients that don't change, they might have a want to change, but the change or the consequences of the change might be more painful. For example, I've been doing a lot of work on myself and business, and I need to be more of a man. I need to take more responsibility. I need to be the strong one. I need to just do it. But that's in certain contexts, obviously. But there are challenges there that we need to face. And a lot of people either aren't willing to do the change to get the thing. And being able to speak to these things, I think, can be quite empowering, because, yeah, life is not always positive or sun shining. That some things do take time and transition to change. And longer term, it will be better. But the shorter term still might be a fair bit of work. And I think that's sometimes things that people struggle to conceptualize.
Yeah. So I've seen some of your presentations at the conferences, and you're really good at not looking at a metaphor in the superficial, but really going into detail and looking at, okay, what does that metaphor mean? So I know for a fact that one of my metaphors is that I look at life like a game. And one of my favorite beliefs is that you either win or you learn, because that's what happens in a game. And, you know, lots of my kind of ways of thinking, I'm quite competitive, you know, most games have rules, all of these kind of things. But I'm curious, because you're very good at delving into these metaphors. If you were to look at what's the benefits and also the problems of someone having like life is a game as a kind of a broad metaphor, what would you, where does your mind take you on something like that?
Okay, so I just want to give a quick pre-frame before I start to go into this. And so when we have metaphors in life, or like broader concepts, so for example, for me, life is an adventure. That's like one of my things. So if we have life is a game, I'm not going to interpret what that means. But what I am going to do is use a very specific type of language called idiomatic communication. And what idiomatic communication is, it's communication that has meaning, but it doesn't have meaning at the same time. For example, if I was to say love to anyone in the audience, you would have a different meaning to what love is for you than it is for me. But for example, life is a game, it's win or lose. That's idiomatic. That's just understood. You get what that means. I get what that means. We don't need to communicate it. We just deeply understand it. And for me, why this is so important is because I'm not telling you what things mean. Because a lot of the time, or sometimes in hypnosis, or if you've ever been on a course and somebody's tried to give you a suggestion that doesn't fit, it's like, it's because it doesn't resonate with what's going on under the surface. So if we look, life is a game. So it's win or lose. It could be said you like to play, you like to be playful. However, if you were to play a lot and you were to lose a lot, you might feel defeated. you might not want to play. Now, there's certain strategies in playing a game. So you might learn up, you might read up on the strategies. You appreciate a good game takes practice. And if you think about business, I mean, even if we look at your background, Adam, I mean, I've started to try and do mine a bit better. But you've got the lighting that they say to create the difference in things. It looks really professional. You have played with the things in order to make it work. However, there is also a winner and there is a loser. So looking at those things, it could be said that some things are black and white. It's one way or the other. So it could be that there's a preference to having that in life. Now, if we're to look at that as an even broader perspective, if it's win or lose, it's black or white, it's one thing or the other, the shades of grey in the middle might be a bit harder to comprehend. However, hypnosis has got shades of grey, so maybe you've started to learn those greyer zones. So if we look at it from a personality profile, you've got people who are more sensing, which is, if you use Myers-Briggs, like sensing, which is more like, it's a picture on the wall. It is a picture with a boat on it. Whereas you've got sensing and intuitive. Intuitive is more like, well, it's a journey that someone's going on. It's a more intuitive thing. So if I was to look at that, I would say you're probably a little bit more literal with what works, what doesn't, one or the other. And similarly, in your practice, I'm sure that you go through methods to look at what works, what doesn't work, exclude. So there's a lot of things that are beneficial about that. Now, we could take that into a broader context. Some people have life as a journey. For you, it's winning or losing. So we've got different metaphors for life and we've got different metaphors for business. So if business is win or lose, that also has certain things. You can't stop playing. Because if you do stop playing, you've lost. You know, there's the whole thing in personal development. You haven't failed unless you give up. Which comes to that whole side.
That's interesting. But I remember seeing a talk by Simon Sinek, who's known for his kind of Power of Why TEDx talk, and he had a book called The Infinite Game, and that really resonated because what he was saying is that in some context, the people that are unwilling to lose under any circumstances will always have the edge over someone that is, you know, have a fixed time horizon. And I think he used the soldiers in the Vietnam War, like, you know, US politics will have a certain kind of appetite for a length of time, but the people who were there, it's like, you know, they were willing for this to go on forever, and that was their kind of time horizon. So I do think that I do have, because I grew up playing lots of video games and board games, there is this kind of gamification, you know, that I look at of life, and it's kind of like, okay, well, you know, find someone who plays the game really well and you can learn a lot from them. That would be like NLP modeling. But then that infinite game, I think, expanded my metaphor, because it's kind of like, what if there's a game and the goal isn't to win, but to level up? And you can never really win the game. All you can do is kind of get to the next level. So it's like an infinite computer game that you level up. Well, then it isn't win or lose. Then actually the kind of the model of thinking is progress, you know, learn, you know, get to the next level, never expecting to win, but always expecting to kind of, as I say, win or learn. So that's the great thing with these metaphors, is that, you know, there's so much nuance and kind of subtlety that you can kind of evolve the metaphor, particularly if, like we do, like we know about metaphors. So once you have that kind of awareness of your own metaphors that you're running, you can kind of tweak them and amend them to make them less disempowering and more empowering.
100%. And I think what's interesting about the example you've given, I've never considered it that way. So if I would say, what's your life like? And we say it's like a game. What's that like? Now, if someone was to play chess, that was their game. That's what it's like. That's very different to what you've described, which is more like a computer game. It is a continuation. One of the other things to consider as a potential coping mechanism, I know I have this a little bit. If I feel like I'm not winning, I play games on my phone. Because then I can win.
True.
So it's interesting to look at some of these things and how they can cross over and how they can map. But yeah, it's interesting to look at the also, like, for example, my stepson, he's quite competitive and things like that, and he's had this big thing about winning, and we're looking to get him to be more collaborative. So we've got games where we all play together to beat the game. So it's a slightly different dynamic. So there's a lot of different games out there, and I really appreciate you sharing your perspective on games. So yeah, so if you had game as a metaphor, what specific comes to mind as an image as that game would be interesting to explore.
Yeah, I think for me it is kind of computer games and the idea of, you know, I grew up with computer magazines where they had cheat codes. So like, you know, and I think that's partly why I was interested in kind of hypnosis and NLP, because it felt like a cheat code for life, you know, and, you know, sometimes you'd have little side quests and, you know, hidden rooms. And I think sometimes, you know, I've got a big project, but I'll start a new project, you know, to kind of give some kind of stimulation. So, you know, I think it's a fairly multi-layered kind of metaphor. And yeah, I guess the downside would be if you had the metaphor of, you know, life is a game. Like one of my belief systems, having worked with so many clients, is that if the game is unwinnable, people don't want to play, and that would be almost you know, a parallel for learned helplessness. And you see that a lot. You know, if people are in a relationship and it's deeply unfulfilling, they kind of psychologically check out, or if they can never get a promotion in their workplace, they just turn up and do the bare minimum. And I think that's where there's kind of like a negative side, that if you feel like you're trapped in a game that you can't escape, but you can never win the game, what most people would do in a situation like that is just, you know, psychologically check out, or, you know, throw a tantrum.
If you think about the game metaphor, they switch off.
They do. That's it.
They unplug. But if you think about, so I always look at the pros and cons, right? So if it is a computer game, it needs a power supply. It needs a certain amount of energy. Now, most games are normally one player. I mean, you can play nowadays with people online and do different stuff, but there is a level of insularness to playing a game. You get fully absorbed in it. So you might forget to do other things because you're so absorbed in the game. Now, because I have life as an adventure, I like doing things, I like doing exciting things. But if you think about adventurers, normally they're not that rich. Because adventurers are going out there, they're exploring, they're always on the search for money, for wealth, those sort of things. But they're like flying by the seat of their pants normally. Really good at solving problems. Exactly that kind of thing. Now, think about if I have to do a mundane task, if I have to do admin, that's going to be really freaking challenging for me, because my overarching concept of life is life as an adventure, and admin. And I mean, I could try and make admin an adventure, but tell anyone, I suppose maybe accountants find out. But so it's about looking at in what context does your because your metaphor, life is a game, and the fact you resonate with that, a computer game, that has clearly made you successful. But I would probably say that in certain aspects of your life, that is problematic. And similarly, I have the same. So it's not about judgment about these metaphors that we have under the surface, but it's looking at, okay, where are they beneficial? Where do they have their limitations? And then you can look and assess those limitations to see, okay, how can I look to do things differently?
And I guess an extension of that is that some people believe that human life as we know it is one big simulation. They call it simulation theory. That actually, if you can create, you know, like something like Sims, where people are like living in a computer, there is the possibility that we're already kind of doing that. And I'm curious, do you consider that a useful or disempowering metaphor, that if someone was to kind of come to you and say, I think we're living in a simulation, like nothing's really real, but you know, because that could be empowering, you know, because you're liberated, you know, to be, you know, the kind of, rather than be the NPC, you get to be the kind of the main character in this kind of simulation. Or it could be really disempowering, like everything is kind of preordained, like, you know, there is a fatalism kind of attached to that. What do you make of that simulation theory as almost a therapeutic metaphor, or just a way of looking at the world?
So I think it would depend on the context to which I approach the individual. But if we look at that, right? So because the person, let's assume the person is correct. I always assume that the client believes they're correct. So let's assume it is a simulation for them. It's like the Matrix, right? I mean, Neo, he was the only one with all the superpowers. But life was tough, life was rough. And for those of us in personal development, self-awareness sucks. I mean, I mean, it's empowering. You can make a lot more out of your life. You can do a lot of great things, but it makes life a lot harder because you realize you have choice and possibility.
Mm-hmm.
So from that side, I mean, it can be quite rich. Well, I mean, would you prefer to be a stim? Would you prefer to plug back in? But the trouble is, once you've unplugged, you can't plug back in. If we're looking at the fatalistic element to it, if I'm to look at that more from a structural standpoint, they don't see any different future. Everything seems preordained. So for me, if I was to look from a therapeutic standpoint, okay, this is where you're at. This is what you perceive to be the reality. Well, what potential futures are there? And I know you do like your multiverse of possibilities and stuff. So for me, I would look, okay, this person has an issue looking at the future because the future seems preordained and they have no choice. And you, I would even do stupid things. Okay, so get a pen, put it in your ear. Was that preordained? I mean, I just told you to do that. So you could play about with lots of variations to get them to start to think that there could be a different future. And if people struggle with the big picture, start with the very, very small, to start to get them saying, okay, well, maybe today is slightly different, to try and shake that map of the world. That's how I would approach that kind of thing.
That's it. Yeah. Kind of break out, if someone has got into the almost like the rhythm of just, turning up. And I remember asking my dad what I thought would be like quite a good thought experiment question. I said, if you could go back to like a random day in your 20s and you just magically appeared in your body and you've got a whole day and then you return the next day back, like what would you do? And he's like, well, what day would it be? And I said, right, it's just a Wednesday. And he's like, well, I'll go to work then. And I'm like, no, you for one day, you get to go back to any day in your 20s. You get to do anything you want, and he's like, but if it's Wednesday, I'd go to work. Like he was almost like so fixated that not what could he do, which is a possibility frame, but what would he have done back then, which obviously was a different thing. But I think a lot of people, the conditioning is so strong that it's difficult to see the world of possibility. And it seems more like, well, I do what I've always done. And it kind of continues almost like an NPC in a non-player character in a game.
So, I mean, when you describe that, what comes to me metaphorically speaking is, so within the metaphors I work with, which are called autogenic metaphors, essentially they're elicited from the client. It sounds like a Groundhog Day kind of scenario, right? Every day feels like the same, every week's the same. And to be fair, for our parents, that's how it was. They didn't have the choice that we have now, a lot of them, and some of us are still in that rat race. But there's a cyclical nature to things. Now, there is a cyclical nature to life in the fact that we have seasons every year, depending on where you are in the globe. But there's also a linear aspect to things we go from one year to another year to another year. Like so there's both cyclical and linear perspectives that we can consider. So if this person is clearly in a cycle, like, I need to break the cycle. So that would be the consideration. How do we create that cycle? And the multiversal aspect, let's just imagine you were here and you saw 3 different paths on that day. Now, the front path is the path that you always look forward to. It was the only thing you look forward to. It was the only way to go. But you noticed that there were 2 different paths just this time. What would happen if you did take a step to the right? So we could invite that to see how that could change perspectives. I would also maybe pick a weekend because then it's not a work day. But even then, it might just be look after the kids, go to the park. Because, some people didn't have choice back then.
Yeah, or it shows a value system based on duty and responsibility, which, if that's a high value system, then the thought experiment of, oh, well, if I could go back to some random day in the 80s, on a Tuesday, I would definitely go to, this kind of place or this theme park or this bar or whatever it might be. That's kind of like a different perspective. It's almost like if you had a time machine, would you really go back and just live a normal day if you could only go back to that time in history for one day? So it's really interesting, like how people think. What's the most impactful metaphor that you elicited from a client in a real session that you thought, I'm borrowing that metaphor, or I can utilize this maybe for yourself or for other clients?
So I think that's quite difficult because I use metaphors in a slightly different sense. Most people are used to them being like stories that you tell.
Mm.
So one of the most impactful metaphors that come to me was actually really interesting. I was working with a guy. Actually, it was at a conference. It was a random demonstration, right? And so at conferences that I go to, I have a little demo table, drawing pretty pictures, going through people's metaphors. But there was this one guy, and he just came out of the health and wellness room at HypnoThoughts. And I'm like, hey, do you want to do a demo? He's like, sure. I'm like, well, what do you want to work on? He's like, anything? I'm like, yeah, anything you like. You can pick anything and we can explore it. And he's like, well, I've got this problem in my jaw. Like, I went to the healing room, they did some stuff, and it's still frigging hurting. I'm like, okay. Well, let's have a go. I've never done psychosomatic stuff, so let's see if it works, So he sits down, and I'm like, so what's that whole thing like? What's that whole thing like, this jaw thing? And he's like, well, it's like I'm sitting down, and it's like there's someone holding my head, like to his left. It's like someone's holding my mouth shut like that. I'm like, okay, that's interesting. So in this situation, you're right relative to this person. You're in the right position. You're looking to do things the right way. He's left to one side. But he's also keeping your trap shut. He's stopping you from speaking. He's stopping you from expressing yourself. He's like, yeah. Oh, but you're also taking it sitting down. You're not taking a stand for anything. It's like, whoa. I'm like, well, let's just try something for a minute. And I said, so you're sitting there. He's holding it. Just take a stand. I don't know what for. I'm not going to tell you what to take a stand for, but just stand up. And he actually did it physically. He stood up. And he looked down at me because I was sitting down. And I looked at him and I'm like, and he's like, it's gone. I'm like, you what? He's like, yeah. And what happens? Well, and what came to him is this was actually a business conversation that he'd had not so long ago, but he didn't speak up. He didn't express himself. He didn't actually communicate what was going on. And so it opened up a whole new world regarding psychosomatic issues and those kind of things, because we talk about how the unconscious is telling us sort of stuff. But one of the challenges with sometimes hypnosis, NLP, a lot of these modalities that work with the unconscious is you don't consciously know what happens. Now, for lots of people, that's not important. For me, I used to not care. But I've started to want to become more self-aware. So this helps me to be actually aware of what's going on under the surface. So for me, that opened a whole new possibility, because I can do this with work. You can do this for any context. Even if, let's say, there's something wrong, you don't know what it is, you've just got a sense of something, you can do work on that. You don't need any further definition because the unconscious is so broad. So I think that's a really interesting example. And change isn't always that quick. But that was just something that's like, wow, that's cool.
Yeah, that is very cool. And I've noticed that when you delve into a metaphor, you almost look at the literal nature, that if that metaphor was absolutely true, what is the structure of that? And I guess that you're calibrating rather than just kind of saying it, and then you're gauging kind of facial expressions. But assuming that they kind of double down and they say, yeah, that's how I see things, then it means that any change that you make to the metaphor is going to feel more profound, because you're already pacing their experience with their buy-in to this metaphor that was just probably unconscious, and now it feels more kind of solidified.
Well, essentially what we're doing is we're pacing and leading experience, but we're doing it in a very smart way. Because I can say you're sitting there, you're listening to this podcast, and you're being curious about what more can I learn. So I can do that, but using the idiomatic communication, because it specifically is meaning-free, but we understand the meaning. So it's not meaning-free, but it is. I can pace that person's experience. So I help that person. Ultimately, what we're doing is we're translating unconscious information from their non-dominant hemisphere and translating into words so that they consciously understand what's going on under the surface. But the other differential with how metaphors and movement works and differs from things like NLP. In NLP, you talk about submodalities. So you change the submodalities, you move them forward, back, up, down. In the metaphors work, we don't change the metaphor. We just change the person's position in that metaphor. So ultimately, as opposed to messing with my reality, I'm the one who's taking steps. So it's all initiated by self as opposed to playing with the structure.
So if you were working with someone that like me, believes that at some level life is a game, where you could be a player, but you could be the games master, you could be the creator of the game. There's different levels of perspectives. So that's the way that you would look at it, rather than saying, right, let's choose a different game to play. It could be a strategy game rather than a board game,
in the metaphors of movement work that I do, we wouldn't do that kind of thing. There's definitely massive value in offering those suggestions. For example, the adventurer mindset I talked about, I decided to change that for myself. Life isn't adventure. Life is a treasure hunt. Should make me more money, hopefully. So but it's similar. It's still aligned. So there's definitely value in that. The way this works is it's more context specific, because if a client's coming to me with a problem context, I want to map that out. For example, it could be you're playing a game, and life is a game, and you're playing against, I don't know, someone who can predict 1,000 moves ahead. So like you say, it's an impossible game. In that instance, I'm like, well, why are you playing the game? Take a different position, go somewhere else. If the game you're playing is unwinnable, do something different. But I wouldn't look to change the game. I'd look to get the person to move away and explore different areas of that context. Because, I mean, I don't know if you've talked to people, I'm sure we all know somebody in business who's been doing the same thing over and over and over and over and over again, but I always fail. Well, are you playing the right game? As opposed to just changing the idea, get them to explore and do a different game. But the trouble is, if they've been playing the game that they failed, they know how to play that game. Even if they don't win, they know. So there's pros and cons because there's a familiarity. Going to find a new game, going somewhere else, that means exploring or doing something different, which is not going to be as comfortable, even if losing is comfortable. So there's those ways I would play about with it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And is there a metaphor that you've encountered that you felt, and let's go a bit doom and gloom here, like the most disempowering or limiting metaphor that you've ever encountered? Someone like literally they said, life is just hell, or something that grim or something like that you're just like, well, even if they change the context within that metaphor, it's still not a great metaphor.
Okay, so I was working with this girl. I tried everything. Right, I tried like so many different things. And for her, I was like, so what's this whole thing like? And she said, I'm falling down a well. Okay, so imagine a well, she's falling, but it's a bottomless well. Now, if someone's, let's say, in a box or a well, we would normally have an intervention that I could do to deal with that. But let me just talk you through her experience. And actually, I was really lucky to see her a few years later. So she's in a dark place. She's going down. The gravity of the situation is bringing her down. She's in a low place, but it's not just a low place. She's getting lower and lower every day. Really depressing. And the problem is she doesn't even know when she's going to hit rock bottom. She doesn't know when she's going to really hit the bottom, but it's going to be pretty impactful. Could be said there's terminal velocity. Now, in this situation, she can't do what's right. She can't do what's left. She can't progress. She's got no way to control her direction. She was literally just going down. She was effed. To be like, that's how it was, right? She couldn't grasp anything. She couldn't, every concept, every intervention I tried to do, she couldn't grasp. She couldn't hold on to. She was just going lower and lower and lower and lower. Now, the other thing is, if I was to be in it with her, I would go down with her. Right? Because, I mean, I can't be anywhere else. I could be outside and I could look down on her. I could be at the bottom, but we don't know if there's a bottom. Ultimately, so that was what her situation was. So I tried everything and nothing worked. And I met her a couple of years later and I'm like, that whole thing, she's like, yeah, I remember it. And she doesn't actually remember that metaphor. She remembers one or two others that we did. And she's like, yeah, just one day I woke up and I realized, what the hell am I doing? And she just got on with her life. She was going through a transition that me as a coach and therapist couldn't help with. She needed a support, because a support is what we stand on. She needed a support. She needed an understanding that I couldn't give her. Now, our understanding what supports us, what we stand on within autogenic metaphor, is normally like why we're there. It's the support that we've got. They talk about 5 whys digging deep. She wanted to know, why is this the case? She just kept asking why and going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. Because sometimes asking why can be really empowering, like Simon Sinek. 5 whys, really useful. But sometimes people ask why so much, and it takes them into such a low place that to get out of that is a bit of a problem. So there are pros and cons to these different approaches. But yeah, it was just really fascinating. I mean, I felt like rubbish because I like helping people. So I felt like rubbish, but then I talked to 1 or 2 other people that I really value within the personal development and change space. And one of them's like, she's just got to get on with it herself, which sucks sometimes. But sometimes, so there was another guy, right? So normally my metaphor, I do metaphors on like ideal clients, target marketing, that kind of stuff. My ideal client is a client, essentially, just imagine the picture. There's somebody looking at lava and they're like, oh, I can't cross the lava. And what I do is I see them, I walk up to them, I'm like, I'll give you a lift. They jump on my back. I jump on stepping stones and get them across the lava. So I get someone from A to B, I get them over a hot place, normally anger, fears, phobias, that kind of stuff. Quick fixes. I get them to the other side. I take full responsibility. I pick them up. I take them over, I drop them off, I leave, they leave, all happy. Basically, I like fixing stuff. But I had this guy, his mum referred me, which was warning number 1. And basically, he was just so focused on how his life was terrible, how his life was rubbish. Basically, he was stuck in a victim mentality in the sense that I was carrying him. Now, can you imagine how tiring that gets when people don't want to take steps themselves?
Mm-hmm.
And I basically said to him, look, I'm happy to work with you. I'm happy to do the work with you. The only thing you need to do, your mum's paying, the only thing you need to do is book your next Zoom session. And he didn't. He needed to, basically, he needed to learn he needs to take responsibility for his life. But then taking responsibility means I'm actually able to do something about it. So that micro step, nothing would change, but that micro step he wasn't willing to do. And some people need to get to a place of pure destruction of who they are before something changes. So sometimes I think as coaches and therapists, we can actually stop people from going through the suffering they need to, which doesn't help them.
It's a very valid point. And it brings me to the point that, you know, mental health is itself a metaphor that, you know, that it's a sickness and health kind of framework. And one of the things that I really liked about NLP is that it was the first time I saw something that looked at things like phobias and anxiety as a learning model rather than a sickness model. And I think a lot of people have bought into this idea of mental health and they're mentally ill. And when they have that belief system that that's the model of what's happening inside and their emotions, then prescription medication is the obvious thing if you're sick. I'm curious, because you're so into metaphors, like, what do you think of the whole mental health metaphor when it comes to, you know, things like emotional or kind of psychological situations?
So, I mean, the dyslexia example with the lady was a good example. She'd been labeled as dyslexic, but her actual thought process was, I read perfectly fine until I don't understand what I've read, and then the stuff goes everywhere. So there was a mental process to that. I had an interesting debate with my best mate, actually, one of our many long nights walking home, and we were talking about, so he has his son has quite severe autism, and he was looking at ADHD and looking at the symptoms and listing all the symptoms he has, and I challenged him. Now, I think for me, labels can be really useful for awareness. They can help people feel really understood and really forgotten. Personality profiles can do the same. However, the beef I have with some of these diagnostics is, does it empower the person? Does it limit the person? Now, I think there are medical conditions, there are stuff, so I'm not going to say that there's no usefulness in medicine. But I always look at what is the specific context and situation that's problematic, and can I start to create shifts in that? For example, as I say, I hate admin. So what do? I put on Latin music. So my internal dialogue can't go round and round. I use an auditory distraction to allow myself to get my admin heavy tasks done. That's how I cope. I could maybe do some more internal work on it, but currently not willing to. So that's how I deal with that, right? So for me, it's what's the specific context, what's the specific problem, what's the specific issue. But the biggest problem, I think, is the vast majority of the populace, as I say, are still in the matrix. So they have no idea that there are different frames of reference. And we have that if there's a problem, you go to a doctor. So for me, it's okay, what's the specific problem? What's the specific context? Do I know how I can shift my thinking? Is there a way of shifting my thinking, or is there not? So I wouldn't necessarily jump to medical diagnoses, but I would take them into consideration as a possibility. But I think a lot of diagnostics can sometimes be used as an excuse, which also people who've got that diagnostic don't like to hear. But it's because they don't know that they might have other choice. They might not, but they may. So I'm always a context to context, problem to problem kind of guy.
Yeah, and I think sometimes a diagnosis can be adopted at the identity level. So rather than someone feels depressed, they are depressed, and then that becomes sometimes a self-fulfilling prophecy to keep them trapped in that story, which again, sometimes can be a bit of a trap like that.
I remember
never ending well.
Yeah, I remember on one of Richard Bander's trainings, he said that for some reason he had some medical issue and he went to the doctor. I'm going to say it's because he had an issue with his leg and couldn't walk. That could be completely wrong, but the basis is there. And the doctor said, "Oh, you'll never walk again." So Richard said, "Come here." And he punched him in the face. Very Richard. But it was more that he wasn't willing to take on that belief, that idea. And my wife's working with somebody who had some sort of medical thing. And so because doctors have authority, we don't necessarily want to challenge that. Not saying it's wrong, not saying they are wrong, but there are other choices. And a lot of the time we're just not aware of that there are those options available.
But you are right. Some people get very defensive at the idea that there might be another way of looking at whatever their condition is. And that might be an autoimmune issue. It might be, how many times have you heard people say, not I experience anxiety, but I have anxiety, like it's a physical, kind of belonging that is kind of attached to them. So yeah, it can be a very sharp double-edged sword. You've got lots of events coming up. You're organizing an event in LA. You're also speaking at Hypnothoughts Live and many other conferences. Tell us what's on your diary and where people can actually work with you.
Okay, cool. So, there's a few different things. If you go to www.metaphorsofmovement.us, that's where I sort of teach and train that sort of stuff. There's also a link in that main homepage if you want to get a free demo of the work, if you're curious. So that's a bit of an overview regarding the training. But yeah, I've got a few different conferences. I'm going to the IAC conference, Hypno Expo, in May, and I'm going to be doing 2 modules on business. One is going to be about how to tailor your marketing specifically to your target audience by ultimately eliciting the metaphor of when you acquired your ideal client. And then we can look at how your marketing works. But we're also going to look at the overarching business structures within your business. And I'm going to be doing a similar business one at Hypnothoughts. And this month, on the 22nd of February, I'm doing an event called Galaxy of the Stars, which is also from the IAC conference, where I'm going to be talking about dancing with dichotomies, which is a 3.5-hour workshop, but it's going to be talking about ultimately a few different polarities, dichotomies within the human personality. So, for example, thinking versus feeling, associated versus dissociated, different time predications. Are you future thinking, past thinking, present thinking? So we're going to sort of unpack those, but we're going to compile stories that you can tell clients, because I believe all problems that clients have these sort of underlying structures. And if you can start to present these stories and talk about how I was really logical, looking all the facts, all the figures, but then I just took a step back and I just looked at the bigger picture for a moment, and I just started to see how all the things sort of connected. If we can pace those experiences, we can give the clients hooks for change to occur. Yeah, and Hypno LA, it's going to be a live in-person event, LA, 19th and 20th of September. And yeah, it's going to be a hands-on event for hypnotherapists, coaches, change workers. And yeah, it's really going to be about practical application, because I'm a firm believer in doing, as is Laurie Donnelly, my co-host. But yeah, it's going to be really, really good fun. So lots of stuff happening. So it's going to be a good 2026.
Yeah, sounds exciting. And have you got an experience or something that the listeners can kind of get a sense of your metaphors of movement?
Okay, so what I'd invite you to do is I'm going to invite you to close your eyes. Make sure you're not operating machinery or doing anything that would hurt you. It's not going to be a deep trance, don't you worry. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to think about a relationship you've got. Could be with a significant other or not, but one that's problematic, but not the relationship, the context itself. In a situation with somebody, and if you were to get an image of that person, where would they be relative to you? Would they be to your right? Would they be to your left? Would they be in front? Would they be behind? Would you be carrying them? Would you be on top of them? Would you look up to them? Would you look down to them? And just get a sense of where that person is in space and time. Now, if they were right for you, they'd be in the right direction. They'd be in the right place. It could be said that they're the righteous one. If they're to your left, it could be that they've been left to one side. They've been left out and you're more right than they are. It could be said that if they were in front of you, you would look forward to them. They'd be ahead of you. Maybe they'd be leading the way. Maybe you'd see eye to eye. If they're in the background, they'd be behind you. You'd put yourself first, and they'd have your back as you would guide forward. Now, if you're carrying them, they might be a weight that you're carrying, something that you're holding on to, and you're taking them places, but they're bearing down on you. Or if you look up to them, you might seem small relative to them. But what I'd invite you to do is I'd invite you to just, in this situation with that person, I'd like you to think, where could I position myself to make this relationship better? What position would I be in relative to them? And as you move yourself now to that position, whatever position makes the most sense for you, just notice what you notice. And then you can notice what happens. And then you can notice how that changes things. And as you notice that, you can, if you wish, in your own time, try different locations, different times, and you can always rewind this part of the recording, if you wish, to try different positions. Because not all positions are the right positions, not all positions are the positions that are not quite right. But in this place, in this space, you can just imagine what it would be like the next time you saw this person in that context. Now you've taken a different position to them, a different stance to them. You've had a different place to them. And you can start to notice the possibility of how that changes things. And with that now, in this space, in this place, I'm going to invite you to come back to the room, alive, alert, awake, and if you like, enthusiastic.
Very interesting.
Boom.
And when you do that, what's the significance of the location? Do you feel like where you imagine that person to be is it kind of demonstrates the dynamic that exists between you and that person, or it's just using almost like cold reading language to kind of allow some kind of change?
So I've done it quite generalized, right? Because I'm doing it for everybody. but we all put people within our mental space. You know yourself, like submodalities we put in certain locations. So this person is there in that location, in that context. For example, my wife is in front of me. I look forward to my wife. She puts herself first, I put her first, and that's why it works. Because she's also quite self-centered. Not necessarily in a bad way, but she puts herself first, I put her first. Now, we had a bit of a challenge when it came to business because she wanted to help me with my business. She wanted to lead the way in my business, and it didn't work. I put myself first in my business. So for me, it's a really good way of understanding the dynamic. But each of these positions, I do some work with corporate environments talking about leadership. Each of these different positions require specific skill sets in order to do them well. So, for example, if somebody's very righteous, they're very right, they know what's right, they know what's wrong. To be right, you need to know the facts, the statistics, you need to know the cultural generalizations of what is correct to do. So if somebody's in the right position, normally righteous is also a little bit judgy. So someone who's right, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, because if, let's say, you're working in quality control or you're telling people the right way to do things or the correct way to do things because they don't know what's right, it can be very beneficial. So it's about looking at these dynamics, and they all have pros, cons, advantages, and disadvantages. So it's about exploring those, but realizing that you can take a different stance. You can take a different position. The challenge is you might need skills and expertise to take those positions on an ongoing basis.
Very fair. Dale, this has been really useful. Give us your website again, just so for anyone who wants to check that out.
www.metaphorsofmovement.us. Metaphorsofmovement.us.
Perfect. I'll make sure that's in the show notes as well. So if you haven't remembered that, check out the description. You'll see some details for Dale, so you can check out all of his upcoming events and training materials and resources and that kind of stuff. Dale, it's been great to have you on the show today.
It's been awesome to be here. Thank you for having me, Adam.
Awesome. Take care. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of The Hypnotist. If you've enjoyed this episode or got some value from it, please give it a 5-star rating and review. And maybe you know someone that would also benefit from this particular episode, in which case share the episode with them so they can also get the benefit too. And if you would like to listen to this episode where it's just the hypnosis, so no intro, no outro, no explanation, just the hypnosis and completely ad-free, there will be a link in the description where you can subscribe at a very low cost and only get access to the hypnosis. So if that's of interest, please check that out. Thank you again for being a regular listener of The Hypnotist, and I'll see you again soon for more.